A warm welcome to you from the Bali, and where we will have the 30-second Freedom Lecture. A welcome to you, all our viewers who are watching us at home through the live stream. We are really happy, and I can say honored as well, that we will have a very special guest today who will take us through the current events in India. And that, of course, is video performance and installation artist Pallavi Paul. She's in India at the moment, and she will join us online. Furthermore, after the freedom speech of Pallavi, we will talk to NOS Financieel Dagblad and Trouw correspondent Aletta Andre, who is currently in India as well, and who will give us a bit of a broader context on police brutality, democratic freedom in India, and the situation around COVID-19. In the last bit of the evening, we will talk to both our guests, and we will discuss the different perspectives on the situation, which of course is very dire. But as announced, first we will go and listen to the freedom speech of Pallavi Paul. A warm welcome to you, Pallavi.
Thank you so much. I think we'll just begin and maybe also keep talking as the evening progresses.
Yes, that would be perfect.
In Children of the Days, which is at once a laconic and hugely expansive almanac of what Eduardo Galeano calls the human rainbow, he writes an entry on Rosa Luxemburg. It's called The Shoe. In 1919, Rosa Luxemburg, the revolutionary, was murdered in Berlin. Her killers bludgeoned her with rifle blows and tossed her into the waters of a canal. Along the way, she lost a shoe. Some hand picked it up, that shoe, dropped in the mud. Rosa longed for a world where justice would not be sacrificed in the name of freedom, nor freedom in the name of justice. Every day, some hand picks up that banner, dropped in the mud, like the shoe. Today in 2021 New Delhi, mud can be replaced by ash. Hundreds of bodies have been cremated every day in the city. Even more lay in piles as crematoriums and graveyards had run out of space. The ash from the pyres that burned through the night rose into the air and landed softly on terraces, on cars, in playgrounds. We, who are still alive, had begun to inhale the dead. This ingestion of pain, suffering, and death has also brought with it a collapse of language. Untimely and abrupt departures of loved ones, the humiliation of not being able to say goodbye, the medicalization of conversations, the anxious reduction of life to oxygen readings and CT images. All this lacerates words. Sentences bleed out and gasp for breath, just like thousands of Indians from whose lungs air has been thieved. The despotic regime of the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, has allied with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The pain this is causing people has been further deepened by a complete collapse of an already tottering public health infrastructure, a targeted attack on non-governmental forces that are trying to step into a governance and policy vacuum, and a complete pillorying of all public institutions of justice. The hand that can retrieve the banner from this ash seems more and more difficult to come by every day. Last year in November, as the central government helmed by Narendra Modi was preparing to implement a draconian citizenship law and the construction of detention camps and prisons for undocumented residents was in full swing, a Madras High Court judge, Justice N. Seshasai, on the occasion of Constitution Day remarked how the freedom of speech, a fundamental tenet of the Indian Constitution, was being misused. He noted, quote, one's caste, religion, and status were being unnecessarily brought into discussions, unquote. The protest that he was obliquely deriding as misusing freedom ran through most of 2019 in different parts of the country. Here, people across communities, in a magnificent display of solidarity and care, rose against the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA, and the National Registry of Citizens, or the NRC, that vengefully marks Muslims, Dalits, women, trans people, Adivasis as doubtful citizens. Justice Sesha Sai, however, is not the only jurist to have suggested that there can be such a thing as too much freedom. The same has also been echoed by no less than the recently retired Chief Justice of our country, the head of the apex juridical body entrusted with upholding the Constitution. Drawing from these observations about a supposed excess of freedom, the head of the Niti Aayog, a technocratic public policy think tank that advises the central government on various policy matters, went a step further to say that, in fact, the problem plaguing India is too much democracy. What does it mean to think of freedom in this milieu? Freedom to do what? Freedom to be whom? To go where? It is clear that in the complete absence of any mechanisms of justice, freedom can no longer be imagined as a choice, a thing that already exists and can be granted or apportioned. Freedom must be re-uttered instead as a provocation to justice, not as a natural byproduct of its performance within rigged parameters. For the purpose of today's talk, I would like to share a short piece that I had written for an independent media portal in 2020. I have changed it a bit to accommodate the upheaval of the months that have followed. It is a reflection on how we can apprehend freedom and reclaim it in what seems like a wasteland. It is from here that freedom can be imagined as an active production, a way to upend the violence of law, a dynamic force that can potentially transform our shared nomos. To be unfree is not merely to be subjugated by a despotic or undemocratic regime. It is to be passive and unimaginative, to forfeit what the legal philosopher Robert Dover called our shared interpretive commitment, to think to renew this commitment many a time against the force of the law, and in the process discerning its limits, is to be free. I call this talk Being as Echolocation. 73-year-old Rajbir Sandhu, a farmer from Punjab, who I met at the Singhu border, which is the border between the states of Delhi and Haryana, remarked, "Every night before going to sleep, we can hear bats and insects. Then in the morning, the birds arrive. It feels as if, just like us, these bats, insects, and birds are also performing a vigil against this brutal government." Unquote. Sandhu is amongst the thousands of farmers who have traveled hundreds of miles from their villages to the Delhi border to protest against the draconian anti-farmer laws that have been ramrodded by the government of India in the middle of a global pandemic. Imposed undemocratically, without discussions with any stakeholders, these laws, in essence, threaten to destroy food security, public distribution systems, agricultural diversity. If not repealed, they will ensure a corporate takeover of agriculture, with millions of farmers eventually losing their autonomy, livelihoods, and dignity. The protest against these laws is only the latest in a series of mass horizontal mobilizations against the policies of the BJP government. Echoes of the outcry against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the abrogation of Article 370, which gave the forcibly occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir special constitutional provisions, the arrest of public intellectuals and activists. And here I would like to take some names: Anand Teltumbre, Sudha Bharadwaj, Father Stan Swami, poet Vara Vara Rao, Khalid Saifi, Ishrat Jahan, young students like Gulfisha Fatima, Natasha Narwal, Devangana Kalita, Umar Khalid, Asif Iqbal, Sharjeel Imam, under terrorism laws can be strongly felt at the Singhu border. I say these names because they need to be said, repeated again and again. They hold within them minds, actions, and spirits whose mere presence threatens despotic power. Many, like Sandhu, have braved a bone-chilling winter incessant rains, scorching summer, 2 waves of deadly COVID-19 infections, and government brutality to nourish the spirit of democracy in India. Temporary structures erected by protesters like tents, mobile toilets, open kitchens, makeshift washing stations have been routinely vandalized by government sympathizers. Nearly 80 farmers have already lost their lives in these protests that have been on since November 26, 2020. While it's difficult to predict how this standoff between despotism and democracy will ultimately play out, I return to the evocative portrait of life and resistance presented by Rajbir Sandhu. The bat, which Sandhu hears as a co-protester every night, and which is the only mammal capable of flying, became a symbol of death and suffering when COVID-19 appeared across the world in early 2020. This was because some early conjectures regarded bats as the source of the novel coronavirus. Due to the lack of definitive data and research, these conjectures soon took on a virality of their own. Social media was flooded with memes, videos, and images that fueled this association between the pandemic and bats. While COVID-19 is still largely believed to be zoonotic, the bat has since been joined by pangolins, civet cats, and minks as possible sources of the virus that has arguably transformed our world forever. Hovering somewhere in the spectrum between an enemy and an ally, something about bats could perhaps hold the key for us to navigate this changed world. Echolocation is the mechanism that keeps bats from flying into obstacles or predators in the dark. Apart from keeping them physically safe, it also helps them find communities, food, and safe places to rest. A fascinating and precise dance, echolocation, is enabled when ultrasonic sounds made by the bat hit surfaces and return to it. The duration of the delay, altered strength, and frequency of the refracted signal helps the bat generate a detailed oral portrait of the environment it is in. Discovered first by a 16th century Italian priest, echolocation or biological sonars have since been widely studied to understand how, in the absence of touch or vision, several animal species can thrive and communicate not just amongst themselves, but also with inanimate surfaces, plants, and other animals. The experience of this pandemic will forever be etched in the minds of those who have lived through it. Today, as we in India face a second wave, almost no home, no family, no community is left untouched by the shadow of death and grief. Our rivers are filling up with bodies abandoned because cremations and burials are becoming unaffordable. Doctors, nurses, and caregivers are collapsing, unable to bear the crushing weight of criminal neglect. Those ill with conditions other than COVID-19 are getting sicker. Those recovering from the virus are looking at job losses and economic ruin. However, this time of great collective suffering and loss is also seeing new articulations of justice, community, and intimacy. People are showing up for one another. Networks of care are thriving. The absence of the state has spawned new bonds of empathy. As we make our way through this year, it is important to keep looking back and reading the thicket of signals produced by these pandemic years. 2020 saw images of workers abandoned in India by employers and the state, walking thousands of kilometers with meager belongings and infants in tow. Citizens reaching out to help one another as tons of ammonium nitrate, along with government apathy, ripped out Beirut's innards. Statues of slave owners were toppled in the West as the slogan of Black Lives Matter resounded across the world. The police murder of George Floyd and its raw horror caught in citizen videos, the glorious Shaheen Bagh protests, outrage against intellectual apartheid and the proposal to block LibGen and Sci-Hub in India, the discovery of Homo sapien fossils in the Bakokiro caves, which restructured our previously known evolutionary timelines, unprecedented ecological calamities like the cyclone Amphan, Hurricane Laura, Asian sea earthquake, and the Australian bushfires, pro-democracy surges on the streets of Hong Kong, Belarus, and Thailand, breakthroughs in COVID-19 vaccine production. To regard all of these moments simply as events would be to miss the crucial suggestion that the pandemic and its accompanying reverberations could have for our imagination of collective life. Even as most of us are under physical lockdowns imposed to contain the spread of the virus, our touch and vision restricted, we sense and respond to these intensities from a distance. This process, however, is not without its own share of interruptions. One such instance was on March 22nd, 2020, when the Indian Prime Minister asked people to display what he called public spirit and thank medical workers fighting on the COVID-19 front lines. He asked everyone to stay inside their houses for the day and at 5 p.m. that evening, come onto their balconies to bang utensils as a token of their gratitude and support to COVID warriors. He christened this enforced retreat and orchestrated gathering as Janta Curfew or People's Curfew. Less than 72 hours later, he appeared on television again, this time with the news that the nation was going into a complete lockdown. Panic ensued and millions of workers found themselves stranded without food, shelter, employment, and transport, subject to the raw terror of police brutality. The cacophony of nationalism and bullish demonstrations of togetherness, duly amplified by television and social media, was an impediment to the possibilities of critical hearing. The distress of medical, migrant, and contract workers, made doubly vulnerable by the virus and state apathy, was being seemingly muffled by an arrogant and deafening clamor. However, there were also those who refused to participate in this republic of noise and held on to mutinous networks of solidarity and hearing. Quietude became a way to resist this swath of sound. This quiet was not an act of resignation or withdrawal from the world. Rather, it was a recognition of the tempestuous churning we find ourselves in. It was an echolocative act. Many could say that images of adversity that flooded our screens produced despair. While this may be true, it is also important to place ourselves within the spirit of commonness that is raging against and taking on the mighty. To imagine pandemic media as echolocating devices, which don't burden us with testimony, but equip us to move collectively towards safety and nourishment, may be key to a generative leap away from what looks like a wasteland right now. Meanwhile, even as a government, deaf to the pain of its people, continues in office, Sandhu and his comrades await their nightly conference with the bats and the birds. My hope is that as we go on, through our work, conversations, and mutual affections, we will all find ways of joining in and producing freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was confronting, it was emotional, and it was very, very good to hear because being in a pandemic and dealing with a pandemic ourselves sometimes makes us lose sight of what happens elsewhere in the world. And our problems at times seem so big that we forget the perspective if you can compare it to what happens in other countries. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences, and thank you so much for this freedom speech where we can discover that you have to deal with so much more than only the pandemic, and that the systems you have sometimes to battle are great and are sometimes tough as well. Is it okay if I ask you something about the speech that you just gave?
Sure.
Right.
Please.
What struck me is that you began your speech with a quote from with a piece from Rosa Luxemburg, and what she said: Rosa longed for a world where justice would not be sacrificed in the name of freedom, nor freedom sacrificed in the name of justice. What does that sentence mean to you?
Yes, I deliberately chose to start with a connection between freedom and justice, because I think that without the component of justice, freedom for its own sake means almost nothing. So whether it's, cultures of consumerism, whether it's even these sort of despotic powers that seemingly, speak of freedom, are actually working against logics of justice, right? So we as people who want a more ethical, more just, more horizontal world, we want to think about freedom as a necessary interlocutor of justice, and not just something that's a self-serving freedom, right? So a lot of, for example, majoritarian discourses will say things like, freedoms are being taken away from the majority, and only the minority folks seem to have the freedom. The majority it doesn't have the freedom to express itself anymore, right? In these situations, or something like a completely hedonistic consumer culture will say, well, you have the freedom to shop and to eat and to travel, etc. But those are all freedoms that come at the cost of unfreedoms of large sections of people, right? So it's in that sense, freedom is not here, in these discourses, is imagined as a fixed quantity, right? Which has to be allocated to some and taken away from the others, which basically works against any logic of justice. So for me, it was very, very important to produce both a relationship as well as point to the fact that there is always a tension at play in the current circumstances, in the current structures that we all live with, between freedom and justice. And that we at all times have to keep our vision clear enough to see that without justice, freedom means nothing.
Because it's change of discourse, but it's almost a change of system. Can you see a remedy in order to understand freedom and the consequences and responsibilities of freedom better?
Sorry, if you could just repeat that question, I'd try and frame my...
Well, it's not only a change of discourse, because the word freedom and what freedom means has been misused, for example, for consumerism. How do we change that around? How do we change that discourse, but also the understanding in something better? Can a systematic change happen? And how should that change happen?
Change is always systematic, because what produces violence is always systemic. Violence is never an event, right? It appears to us sometimes in a flash as an event, right? Or something like, for example, police brutality. It will flash up in a moment, and we are able to see it, whether whether it's George Floyd or the violence which has happened here in our part of the world, on students, etc. But what enables that event to occur is very much a system that's in place, right? So it's always structural. Violence is always structural. And in that sense, any change has to be structural, I would say. And I think to insist on the question of justice is one way of interrogating structures, which have hollowed out the idea of freedom from the inside and actually repurposed it to serve, corporations or militias or repressive, state regimes, etc. So I think the insistence on what justice means, what does it look like, who is within the purview of the imagination of justice, who has been left out. I think these are questions, if we insist on them, it is inevitable that we will come to a point where there will be a structural change, where there will have to be a structural change, because it is the structure that's producing it.
And for that change to happen, we have to emphasize that freedom and justice go hand in hand.
That's right, yes.
Right. Thank you so much for now. Of course, we will continue our conversation later, but first we will get in touch with Aletta Andre, who is in Delhi as well. I understood you're quite near each other, but you have never met before, right?
Correct.
Correct. Aletta, you're a correspondent for the NOS in South Asia and covers the news from there. Well, that's quite a big area, so I can imagine that it's quite a challenge at times. You will not only update us about the current situation, but you will also give us specifics on how to cover and convey India and the news from India to the Netherlands. So I would say the virtual floor is yours.
Right. First of all, thank you, Pallavi, for your speech, your words on freedom, and also your movie, Blind Rabbit, dealing with police violence in India, which I have taken as a starting point for what I prepared to say. The movie shows footage and uses audio clips that go back many decades, but also from very recent events, particularly those of February 2020. That month, very violent riots were spreading in northeast Delhi, very close to our homes. Dozens of people were killed, and most victims were Muslims, though Hindus were also killed, but it were mostly Muslims amongst the thousands of people that I and others later saw in camps as they had lost their homes. These homes were torched by mobs, shouting slogans, hailing the Hindu god Ram. And it were also Muslims that were held to the ground by police officers, as can be heard in Pallavi's film, while being asked to sing the national anthem. So basically, you could say that based on their religion, their loyalty to the country was being questioned by these officers. And one of the young men died soon after he was released from police custody. The origins of the riots were a protest side against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which Pallavi also referred to in her speech. The most infamous part of this act would allow refugees from a few neighboring countries to get Indian citizenship faster and easier than others if they belonged to one of the listed religions. And pretty much every big world religion is in that list except Islam. So many critics have challenged this for being unnecessarily exclusive, while for many Indian Muslims, this was again one step further towards making them feel like second-rate citizens, who may also become more vulnerable for harassment when it comes to documents proving their citizenship. So the act was protested against 24/7 at many places all over the country, and at least 20 sites, I think, in the capital alone. And one of these sites was the location where the riots first broke out, when it was attacked. According to many reports, this attack was directly instigated by Kapil Mishra, a politician of the ruling Hindu nationalistic party, BJP. He called on the police to disperse the protesters from this one location in his constituency and told his supporters that they would take matters in their own hands if the police would fail to do so. And it was hardly an hour later that the first stones were thrown. I covered these riots and their aftermath as a correspondent in Delhi. On 26 February, when it had largely calmed down, I called on the phone a young lawyer and Congress politician, Ishrat Jahan. She was also in the list of names that Pallavi just named. She had been quite active at one of the protest sites in northeast Delhi, near to where the riots took place. And I wanted to ask her if that site was still up and running. By coincidence, she picked up the phone just as she was being arrested. When me and my husband, who is also a journalist, arrived a few hours later at the police station where she was being detained, a group of lawyers was at the door arguing with the officers. As the atmosphere turned quite grim, we decided to leave. The lawyers later put out a statement saying that they had been beaten with sticks by the police and refused entry to meet with their client, Jahan. When Jahan was produced in court a day later, her hand was seen to be wrapped by Band-Aid. Her sister later sent me a video via WhatsApp showing how the police had shoved her in their car while the protest site was being completely dismantled. And while the riots were not cause for every single protest site to be dismantled, Corona was, because the first lockdown started soon after. And while protest sites were being dismantled, it also made it impossible for many arrested individuals to get bail because the courts were not functioning. Later, Jahan and others who had been active in the protests against the Citizenship Act were booked by the police under the recently amended Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, an anti-terror law under which individuals can be held in prison without trial, without bail. She is still in jail. The riots and following investigation into the alleged instigators exposed existing prejudices within the police regarding minorities. And this triggered a demand from opposition leaders to probe the role of the Delhi police, while also the Delhi High Court questioned the decisions of the police particularly not to file a first information report against the BJP politician Kapil Mishra, despite complaints regarding his speech. But these prejudices have been there since long and were not hidden also before the 2020 riots. In 2019, a survey was done by the research organization Center for the Study of Developing Societies amongst almost 12,000 police personnel in 21 states. On average, half of all police personnel believed that Muslims are more likely to commit crimes than people with other religions. And similar biases are there for members of scheduled castes, tribes, and migrants from other states. Speaking about this brings back images we saw during the first lockdown last year, when hundreds of migrant workers saw no other options but to walk home, often hundreds of kilometers. And at roadblocks and state border crossings, they faced police personnel with sanitizing spray, not for their hands, but for their entire bodies. They had to squat down to receive the spray, and soaked, they could continue their journeys. The 2019 survey revealed that police does not receive much training after they join the forces, for example, for crowd control or sensitivity when it comes to other groups in society, despite various committees in the past decades having recommended more training and investment in the police force. Another lockdown story was more gruesome. A father and son in the southern state of Tamil Nadu were arrested because they had kept their shop selling mobile phone accessories open beyond the curfew rules. 2 days later, they came out of the police station dead and full of marks of torture and sexual abuse. The accused policemen in this case, 9 of them, are all in jail following national media outrage. But in many other cases, police officers guilty of such acts face no action, or it comes many, many years later. Just last month, it was reported that a local court in the state of Uttar Pradesh ordered the government to reply to a petition seeking justice for the killing of 72 Muslims by police in 1987. In another famous case from that year, the killing by police of more than 40 Muslims from the same state, 16 police officers were convicted to life in jail. But it happened in 2018, 31 years later. By then, all of them were retired after continuing to serve the police for decades, even after they were accused and surrendered to the court. A police officer who later wrote a memoir about this case described how it seemed as if no attempts were made to prove the accused guilt, rather to make a chaos of the evidence. And this is not ancient history. In 2020, the year of corona-related lockdowns, the National Human Rights Commission recorded 1,680 cases of custodial deaths, which was an increase compared to the pre-pandemic period. And even in 2019, almost half of all police personnel surveyed said they were willing to use extrajudicial means to address crime. And in a few states, it was even as high as 70%. This reminds me of a news story that had come just before the Delhi riots. In the southern city of Hyderabad, a young woman had been gang raped and murdered. The suspects, who happened to be poor laborers, were shot dead by the police. They had allegedly tried to flee. Though they had not been put to trial and they were not convicted, this act was highly accepted by the public also, celebrated even. In the context of gang rape and murder and the extremely slow court cases that often follow and the low conviction rate of rape accused, the public, including the woman's parents, felt that justice had been served. This while the same police dealing with this rape case had also been accused of not taking the case seriously immediately. Because the biases that are there regarding minorities being supposedly prone to crime are there also against women and them being a victim of crimes such as rape and sexual assault. Victim blaming is very much there amongst police personnel, even female officers. This was highlighted after the infamous 2012 Delhi gang rape, which ultimately led to the law being amended. One thing that came out of that is that the police will be punishable if they do not write a first information report when a woman complains of sexual assault. Another change was that there should always be a female police officer available to write down the complaint and a female inspector to investigate it. But almost 10 years down the line, the police pretty much all over India is still working on hiring enough women to oblige. Meanwhile, rape and murder accused with political connections, unlike those poor laborers who got shot in Hyderabad, have reportedly gotten out on bail only to intimidate the victims and their relatives into dropping the cases. And this is not surprising, considering one more outcome of the 2019 police survey. 65% of police personnel have frequently experienced political interference in investigations. There are a lot of regional differences, as the police in India is a federal state subject. And of course, some individuals make all the difference. And I would also really like to highlight meeting multiple extremely inspiring, respectful, hardworking police officers who are proactively making a huge difference for the people in their communities. But in general, the question has been raised by observers whether a lack of political priority may explain why recommendations of committees for police reforms through decades have been largely ignored. And similarly, laws against torture, though being drafted, have not been prioritized to be passed as acts. India is one of few countries that have not ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, despite signing it in 1997. The Citizenship Act was passed by both houses of parliament with much priority, just like those new farm laws. And another much talked about act that the government has worked on is the Information Technology Act, by framing new rules under this act for digital content. The rules were announced in February and have now been rolled out. And it means, amongst other things, that social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp have to remove unlawful content without delay when the Indian authorities request so. In practice, Twitter has reportedly been asked to remove content critical of the government. But when Twitter flagged posts by ruling party members as manipulated media, the Delhi police visited the company's office in India. This happened just last week. In a statement, Twitter expressed concern over the potential threat to freedom of expression. So the battle over information seems to have intensified during the pandemic. Journalists have been charged with sedition over tweets they wrote based on eyewitness accounts of those large farmer protests earlier this year that Pallavi also mentioned. And during the second wave of Corona, citizens in the state of Uttar Pradesh were threatened to face charges related to national security if they would spread rumors. And arrests were made for SOS calls for oxygen on social media. Internet activists have expressed their worries that all this may lead to self-censorship. And journalists on the ground have told me that it's much harder for them to find sources that are willing to speak on the record, even on Corona-related stories. These are reasons that have contributed to India ending up lower on international lists measuring democracy this year. Of course, I would definitely argue India is still a democracy. The election committee is highly respected, elections are well organized and reach the most remote areas. Courts have shown independence, and media, including electronic media, independent journalists, are able to report on these matters critically. Still, one of the organizations making these international lists, Freedom House, has this year downgraded India to be only partly free. Now, what this means for whom and to what extent is true may be debatable, but it can surely be taken as a warning that not even in the so-called world's biggest democracy, freedom can be taken for granted.
Thank you, Aletta. This broader perspective exposed a little bit how complex the Indian situation is and how inequality is part of society, it seems, and the complex role police plays in that context. Pallavi, can I give you the room to react to what Aletta just shared with us? Is that something you agree with or something that you recognize or oppose?
No, Aletta has done a really wonderful job in a way of bringing together various kinds of moments that are symptomatic, perhaps, of what's going on in the country. And while each of these have happened in sort of different places at different times, they're all connected via the story of what's actually going on, right, in terms of repression and the abuse of power. I do think that perhaps electorally the sense of democracy is still there, but I do think that there is, in effect, I would say that in effect there is no democratic horizon, as it were, right? Because it has been reduced. This is precisely the vulgarity of the moment right now, is that the idea of democracy has been reduced to representation, to numbers, to voting, to elections, right? And what that has done is that is precisely how certain kinds of ideas of justice and accompanying freedoms are getting eroded, because everything is just about representational logic, right? And in that sense, I think that this is I think what we need to do today is make a fundamental critique of democracy itself, rather than actually think about or sort of maybe yearn for a time when there was seemingly more democracy, or I think what we now need to do is revisit what the idea of democracy means. What are its limits? Clearly, the limits of what democracy is are visible to us today, right? Where holding an election can seemingly be a face for or a veneer behind which all of these kind of terrible excesses can continue to happen, right? And like I was stressing, that just like violence, and repression is structural, I think democracy as a structure, or at least in the way that it's been, functioning, has actually enabled these things to happen, to enable these things to occur. So I also think that accountability of public institutions, of what the executive ought to be doing, of how the courts ought to be responding, all of this should be rethought in the context of a critique, of a fundamental critique of democracy.
And how do you react to the example that Aletta has given when the rapists were shot by police? That is not a democratic act, of course, but it still was applauded by the parents of the woman who was raped, by the community there. What is your reaction to that?
See, of course, I mean, it is an act of complete. It's a appalling, and it's an abhorrent sort of thing that happened, and it's a vigilante idea of justice, right? Which is very tied to actually the power of the state that gets sort of congealed around these functionaries within the police. But I think what is a larger thing that we need to sort of think about and be alarmed by is how does an act like this get applauded by the public? Why does it get applauded by the public? And the reason for that is that because democracy is this vulgar, the electoral democracy is this vulgar idea of representation and numbers, the people who don't figure in those numbers just become dispensable, right? They can be done away with. And this is the reason why the weakest, the most vulnerable, so like, working classes, or like Muslims, or, Dalits, these locations are actually, they find no kind of representation in the larger story, in the story of mainstream power and democracy and all of this. And therefore, this can be done, right? Therefore, an act like this is okay for a majoritarian imagination. It's fine, because these people don't matter, because actually they don't find representation in the larger structures, in the electoral structure.
Well, and
I think
it's also,
this enables violence.
Right. And isn't it also the case that, we all feel that at times we would appreciate an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And if that actually happens when somebody has committed something bad, that, that satisfies that urge. But in a larger democratic, it means that with democracy, as with justice and with freedom, comes responsibility. How do you make people understand what responsibility comes with democracy? And it's not about, satisfying your urges. Is that possible to make people understand that?
I mean, I think it's about a culture of creating. It's about culture of creating an ethical, political sort of impetus in any moment that you are live through and belong to. And I think that as far as this particular case is concerned, I would again like to return to the concrete, like Aletta said and pointed out very importantly that there was no trial. These people had not been proven to be guilty. Right, there was no way for us to know whether actually this horrible act of this gang rape and eventually this woman was set on fire. This veterinarian, we don't have any evidence to prove that these men did this act, right? And yet they were shot and killed, and their murder became a cause for celebration. So it's not even about and if this is how we're going to function, then we might as well do away with any intervening things like courts or institutions of public justice. This is a vigilante, a populist form, right? Which is very alarming and which is, I think, fundamentally against any ideas of justice or ethics.
Right. I would like to take a moment to focus on the COVID situation and the connection with the misuse of COVID in order to bring about political change or political ideas. Because do you believe that this current COVID situation has underlined or exposed the underlying political issues in India? And Aletta, I would like to ask your opinion about that as well. But can I start with you, Pallavi?
Yes, for sure. I think that what the virus has done is that it has exposed, the existing inequalities, disparities, access to help, medical help, and other kinds of, with lockdowns also, economically, it made, large sections of people so vulnerable, right, that it was difficult, even survival was questioned for large numbers of people. But I also think that what has happened, especially in the second wave, is a very odd thing that there has been suddenly it was like nobody was untouched by grief, misery, death, etc. Right? So the hospitals were so full that even people who could perhaps afford a hospital bed couldn't get one. Right. So there has been a kind of, and I hope that will lead to a kind of a rethinking and a calibration of collective life, because just as suffering was kind of more, I would say, widely or perhaps even evenly distributed, especially in the second wave, even networks of care and help and empathy, I think, emerged, right, in the complete absence of any kind of state presence or, concern for people.
Yeah.
It was, groups of, people who started showing up for one another, citizen groups, etc.
Yeah, acts of community and acts of solidarity have been exposed, existed as well, or grew as well, and that was good to hear. Aletta, if I can ask you as well, COVID has influenced your work as well as a journalist. At times, things were more restricted than they were before, but still that affected the freedom you have to travel and to report on the situations that is happening in India. Can you explain a little bit about that as well?
Well, I mean, in the first lockdown, nobody was able to travel domestically. There were no trains, there were no planes, so we could not go anywhere. As a journalist, I was very free to travel around Delhi. I could just, and it wasn't even so strict. No need to apply for a special card. I show my international press card, but I think there were biases at play there as well. And I have experience from my own neighborhood. I was telling Pallavi, I live in Nizamuddin West, and it was kind of the first hotspot of Delhi, where COVID was broke out in a big number, because very nearby there was a big religious gathering. And the first, initially all the cases were traced and tracked very actively, and half of them across the country were traced back to this particular place. And so we were kind of the first containment zone, and the army was there, and there were a lot of roadblocks, etc. And Just around the corner, there's this area which we call a basti, which is kind of an urban slum. And there were big gates and army guys. People were not able to go in and out, whereas my part of the neighborhood is a bit more, like for more wealthy people. So there we were already allowed to move more freely. If I wanted to move out of the neighborhood on foot, just by saying, "Oh, okay, I'm going across the street for grocery shopping or whatever," it was allowed, Whereas my husband, who wears a beard and who is, brown, was not allowed to exit the neighborhood. There were clear biases at play, very clear biases. And when he wanted to meet someone who was just standing outside of the gate, it was not allowed. When we had a delivery guy delivering fish, which is food, which is supposed to be essential, but then it's non-vegetarian, the delivery guy was slapped by the police in front of his eyes. All of these things happened right in front of us. So as a foreigner, I experience these biases in a I wouldn't say it's a positive way, but you.
But there's another side to that as well.
Yeah.
But as a journalist,
sure.
You're not allowed freely to travel anymore and to report, because is it correct that in certain areas you're assigned a guide in order to report?
That kind of it predates COVID in a way. I think it was in August 2019 when the partial autonomy of the region of Kashmir was cancelled, and even before that, they had decided that foreign journalists now needed to apply for permits to visit this region. That had even happened half year before that, so early 2019, I would say. More and more areas were added to a list of regions, particularly bordering regions, for which foreign journalists need to apply for a permit to go. So that has been happening. That has been kind of developed. That has been happening even before COVID.
Is it comparable to countries as China or Korea?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, in China there are a lot of restrictions, and I was just not too long ago, I saw a report done by one of my colleagues there who traveled to the region where they have these camps for the Uyghurs. In English, how do we say the Uyghur? The re-education camps, so to say. You're not restricted from traveling there. He goes there. But when he's there are people following him everywhere, putting their hands in front of his camera. People are not speaking. They're not even saying hello. They're not speaking a word because they're worried of speaking to journalists. So he can go, but then his report, the way you are reporting there, is highly restricted. But in the case of these bordering areas of India, bordering China, bordering Pakistan, we cannot even go at all. So you can apply for the permits, but for Kashmir, for example, no foreign journalists has been given the permit since August 2019. 3 journalists have gone on the invitation of the government on an organized trip, but otherwise nobody who has applied for the permit has gotten the permit. And even for other areas, it's very difficult to get the permit. Often the permit request goes unanswered, and then the minimum period that the ministry says they need to give it is 8 weeks. So that kind of divides the purpose of news. If something happens somewhere, you cannot apply for the permit and go the next day. It will take weeks, and then you might have other plans. So that restriction has grown in the past few years in India. That even if you have a resident journalist visa, that doesn't automatically give you the right to travel everywhere
and to report. Can we say, Pallavi, can you state that freedom of speech is a luxury in India? It's not a given; it's a luxury, and it's only applicable for a certain small group of people, or is that too black and white?
There is plenty of freedom of speech of particular kinds of people, right? There is no dearth. Again, I'm saying I want to qualify this idea of freedom, right? There is a lot of freedom to spew hatred, There is a lot of freedom to, deride, women, Dalits, migrant workers. There's a lot of freedom to do that. So in that sense, there is no dearth of freedom. What is the problem is that freedom has gotten uncoupled from any index of social justice, and that is the issue. And which allows for certain kinds of utterances or articulations to be criminalized, right? So right now, the idea of criminality has also been turned on its head in India, right? So to be a journalist, to be an artist, to be an intellectual, that is criminal. Whereas to actually spew hatred, like Aleta mentioned, Kapil Mishra, that is not considered criminal. In fact, that would be defended under the guise of freedom of speech. So I think we have to be careful when we say that we want freedom of speech, as an unqualified blanket thing. I don't think so. I think what we want, or what I would want, is a connection to be reestablished between freedom and ethics and justice, and then assess.
How many people feel the same way that you do, and can you detect a movement where the current situation, the status quo, is being opposed, or is it too small to be a movement, or is it only individuals who feel that way? What is your perception?
2019 saw, like a huge, number of people come out and in protest, right? Interestingly, the students have helped this movement. Women have helped this movement. So everyone whom these freedoms of speech that exist right now being used against are the ones who've come out and expressed their resistance to, and very openly, and in very inventive and wonderful ways, through art, through culture, poetry, to push back. So I definitely think that we all sense, like I said, it's an echolocation that's ongoing. So the fact that I feel like this is because there is, this is in the air. There is, these thoughts are flying around. And I think are being, relayed across. So I do know it's definitely, there's a huge pushback, and there is a huge, impetus to kind of rethink what it means to be free and what freedom is.
Right.
Yes.
Aleta,
I also think, No, I thought I'll point out that that now these strict, internet rules that are there for social media are. Can be very limiting for it, because for many people in India, social media has been the platform to express themselves, the only platform to express themselves. Also, people from lower castes or, different minority groups that have not much of a space in mainstream media. They've really used social media to set up their own platforms. And,
but that is with risks as well, because people are being arrested for what they post on social media.
Well, yeah, now it's becoming, more restrictive, and so it's interesting to see where that will go.
You as a journalist, okay, let's make a statement just to see what your reaction is. My statement now is, to provoke you, you cannot work as a journalist in India because the restrictions are too big, and therefore you cannot report on what really happens. How would you react on that?
I would say that is not true for India. Of course, it is true for certain areas where I cannot go without a permit. Though even in those areas, it's not that foreign journalists don't report, but they work more closely together with local journalists that can go. So, for Indian journalists, the same restrictions are not there. So if you have Indian colleagues or, like co-workers that you can work with together, and they go and you trust them and they are your eyes and you work together, you can report. And in the rest of India, where I can go and move, often it's actually quite easy to get access to places. You don't have to ask permission beforehand. Now with Corona, for example, you can go to local areas, visit the health centers and speak to people. Not everyone will speak on the record, but that is the main issue actually. Like even doctors, because if they're, under contract with the government, they will not speak on the record. They don't want to lose their job.
That's another provocation I would.
But we can see, we can understand.
Yeah. There's another provocation I would like to present you with, again, just to see your reaction. As a journalist from Holland, it's not possible to report and to judge democracy as well because your context is too Eurocentric. It's impossible to compare European values regarding democracy to the Indian values. Again, a provocation. How would you react to that?
Well, I suppose with many subjects, you can argue that it's really hard for an outsider to understand the inside situation, and we're here to try to understand the local context. So with democracy, what Pallavi just said, like we shouldn't just see it from the lens of elections. That is, of course, an important thing to keep in mind. And maybe that we think of democracy as elections because a lot of the other freedoms we take for granted. And again, we cannot do that. And also, participation, representation. Like actually, the Indian democracy is extremely complicated. There's so many regions and regional elections and hundreds of parties. And on the one hand, there's so many participants that you think there must be representation for everyone. But on the other hand, you come to know that a lot of participants just, have the money power, have the muscle power, and that on a very local level, elections may not even be so free, on a village level for everyone or for every place or for every, person, for every group in society. And and sometimes it is hard to understand. Yes, for sure. And the longer you are here, I mean, I don't know if that's a cliche saying that's said for many countries, but for India, they say the longer you're here, the less you understand sometimes. After 1 week, you can write a book, but after the 11, 12 years that I've been here, that's become more and more difficult.
Yeah. Pallavi, you are very outspoken. You share your visions, you share your ideas. Are you ever worried about your own safety? Because it's not without any consequences that people speak out their minds.
No, I'm not worried about my safety because I think that there are people who have far more, who put themselves between, actively between, structures and, possibilities of getting, kind of just, bulldozed by state power in a much more active and a rigorous way. But I think the reason also why I'm not worried for my quote-unquote safety is also because I'm an artist. I'm not, an activist. I'm not a political commentator. I'm not a journalist. And I think that being an artist allows me to move freely between these different worlds, but also create another order of, an aesthetic order of trying to, find an interpretive route back into the world. I think while, of course, the work has to come out from this world, from this really chaotic, world that I'm in right now, it is definitely not, as directly connected to the everyday life of state power as the work of a journalist or an activist or somebody like that.
You are an activist.
I also want to just quickly jump in on the previous conversation that you were having about the, in a way, I think, what's also implicit in that provocation is the idea of a certain kind of European supremacy, of whether it's a democratic, imaginary, etc. And I think that that's something that I definitely want to express my resistance to, and also a difference from, because I think it's what is very important while we discuss the erosion of certain kinds of ideas of justice, etc., is that we must, I think, at least I'm very careful that I don't want to fall into the trap of portraying India as this kind of savage zone where nothing works, and democracy is elsewhere and needs to be aspired to. I think this is a logical production. What we are seeing today is a logical production of global capital. It's a logical production of structures at play which have which run across the world and the Western world, etc. as well.
Right, and I think you totally. I agree with you completely, and what you expressed as well. And I thought that was beautiful. That there's a global solidarity as well. The way you told us how people reacted in India to the murder of George Floyd makes it a global solidarity that can be used in different ways. And it's just the hierarchy that you talk about, that you mentioned, or the supremacy that you mentioned, that's something, that I oppose to, where it's very easy to judge from a certain context what happens in India without taking the Indian context in account. But that is, that's separated from the fact that certain universal ideas of justice and freedoms should be taken in account forever, I believe. We're entering the final stage of our conversation, unfortunately, and we mentioned the position of women just briefly. Is it getting better? Is the position of women at the moment, and of course there are different kinds of women in different, social classes as well, but is the position getting better? Is something changing in India, or are we dealing with a status quo?
Again, I would respond by asking you if you would ask the same question to an artist from America.
Yeah, actually I would, because, and even an artist from the Netherlands, because what we see globally is that inequality between men and women in an economic sense, on every level, it's very unequal. And yes, actually I would, because I think we should globally do something about that in America, in the Netherlands, and India as well.
Right. Yeah, okay. And in that spirit, then I would like to sort of also complicate then the category, this kind of, closed category of woman. And, because there, again, there is power, entitlement, also resistance, which is, again, unequally distributed in this very complicated landscape of femininity or who is a woman and all of this. So I do think that, of course, there are active negotiations every single day, especially in the context of, Leta mentioned, acts of sexual violence. I think those are the sites in which these questions become very, very potent. So just a few days ago, a very baffling and bizarre judgment has come in the rape case against journalist Tarun Tejpal, where the court has spoken about how the victim did not seem to behave in a way that's fitting of somebody who has been sexually assaulted in the aftermath of the incident. Now, this is very baffling, because what is the ideal behavior, right, of a victim of sexual assault? Is there, a manual? Is there a rule book which one needs to, stick to? So there is always, these kinds of negotiations always ongoing, and I think they show you something about the way in which a woman's body, her sexual confidence, her all these things are still something that society doesn't know much how to deal with it, how to place it, what to actually make of it. So yes, I think I don't know better or worse. I also don't know which woman or what kind of woman one is thinking about when one is thinking of better or worse. But on the one hand, there is something like the Hathras, murder and the burning of the body of the victim by state authorities in the middle of the night, right? So a violation not just in life but also after death, which is directly connected to her caste, which is directly connected. It's an act of not just sexual violence but also caste violence, right? So all of these subjectivities of social location, caste location, gender, they're very much in conversation with one another. So that's one end of the spectrum. And on the other end is this threat that a sexually confident woman who is not, so-called socially vulnerable in that sense, right, via caste or class, is also a threat of another kind because she's not behaving like the ideal victim. So I think we're swinging between these two very strange, points, I think.
Right.
When we think.
Yeah, thank you. And again, the theme is globally very complex, and your insight makes things even more complex to understand, or to understand how to deal with that, or how to position ourselves between the swings that you explained.
It is also, just maybe if I can briefly say, because since 2012, the topic of women in India has been very popular, so to say, also with editors, and it's often comes up, and I'm also asked about it, and I do stories about it, and especially then, I think part of my job felt like pointing out that there are all these differences in Indian society, and that for a woman like me, it's actually, I experienced this at a very safe place, like I face much less street harassment than compared to Paris, for example, or, these kind of things. And also a lot of stories have come out from the Netherlands about how rape victims are being treated and how low the conviction rate is and how difficult it is to prove. And also on the basis of post-incident behavior, cases are being built or destroyed. So that is a problem everywhere. And the last thing I would say about it, that, some stories that have really impressed me in this context is of girls, victims of lower classes, lower castes, with powerful perpetrators that chose to fight their case, even if there's a low chance of conviction, even if they face, all these opponents at the police and the court, and character assassination and social boycotts and threats to their families and to their lives. But they fight, and I think the number of cases that are registered are higher in India. And though it doesn't maybe change something for the perpetrators as of now, for the victims, that's already very important, I think, that they speak up, and that it's not a taboo for these for groups that earlier it was for.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't think we should fool ourselves that we, or in any country, things are equal or better in the sense that the inequality should be mentioned and should be fought as well, because there is a huge inequality in every country. And again, that was a valid question, Pallavi, when you asked me whether I would ask that same question about women to people from other countries. And actually, again, I would like to emphasize, yes, I would, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we've come to the end of the evening, and I wondered, what is the most important point for you both that people who are watching at home should take away from tonight? Pallavi, can I...
I'd let Aletta lead that.
Well, I don't know. We touched on so many topics, and even preparing for what I was going to say, I was going, how am I gonna put everything in there? There's COVID, there's democracy, there's freedom, there's police violence, there's and then we dealing with minorities, but the term minority also in India, it has so many levels. You have like religions, you have caste, you have women, you have class and status, and so I think when it comes to freedom and democracy, and when we think of participation, that's also something very important that underlies all of these things, in which way people are truly represented on all levels of authority, and not just in politics, but also in the police, or in the people that we have to deal with on a daily basis, that it's something that's much to do, and
Right.
and something to always keep in mind in what is the background of the people that we're dealing with. That is important.
Right. Thank you so much. Pallavi, can I give you the final words of tonight? What should people take away and what is important for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I would like to enter it artistically because that's what I know, that's what I do. And I think for me, while all of these questions are kind of sliding across one another, and with the urgency and with the velocity that's, overwhelming even sometimes while one is living through it. I would say that art, especially, like the film that I've attempted and the work that I generally make as well, is definitely ricocheting off this kind of velocity and off this kind of movement. But I also feel that it's also a site of transformation. That is the adventure of art. The central adventure of art is not only to be limited by what is, but also what can be, what is possible. And I think that in that spirit, I would like to think of art and of culture as an observatory, where possibilities of transformation become palpable, where they become visible. And I would very much like to hold on to that in the face of what seems otherwise to be just a landscape of doom and collapse.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing both of your stories. And I totally agree. Art can be used to think of what can be and what possibilities there are as well. My takeaway personally is that I understood that freedom and justice should go hand in hand, and that with democracy comes great responsibility as well, and that we should always be aware of that. And you made that very poignant today, Pallavi. Thank you so much for that. And also, Aletta, thank you so much for your insights into India. And both of you unveiled how complex of a society it is, but where there is hope, there is art as well, and things can change. So again, thank you for your insights. Unfortunately, I have to say goodbye for now. Hopefully we can continue this conversation in real life. That would be nice, instead of with screens, and to meet each other again, whether in India or here in Amsterdam. So thank you so much for your stories, and hope to meet you in real life. And I wish you a lot of courage, a lot of strength to deal with the situation that is happening now in India. And hope to talk to you soon again. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
And I would like to thank the viewers as well. Thank you for watching this program. Hopefully you got inspired by the stories that you heard. If you would like to know about our Freedom Lectures, or if you would like to know about our programs, please check our website, bali.nl. There you can find more episodes, previous episodes of the Freedom Lectures, and you can see what is in store. We've got a beautiful program. Thanks again for watching, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.